Hey, we've got some viewers. All right. Thank you for showing up. Hi, my name is Dr. Patrick Biggs. I'm with Purina Animal Nutrition. I'm here to talk to you guys about chickens for Grange Co-op there in Oregon. So I've got a list of questions that you guys have sent in over the past several days, and I'm going to get to those questions. And then we're going to discuss kind of all things chicken. So as you're watching, if you have questions, comments, post them there in the section. I'll watch along, and if I see a question come up, I will get to it. So post in there, like, do you have chickens? How many you have? Whether you've just gotten chickens, whatever chicken-related tidbit you think you might want to share with the audience, go ahead and post it there in the comments section. So, all right, first things first. We got to get started with chickens. So, why do you want chickens? Well, I think most people want chickens because, well, those chickens give you eggs, and eggs are a great thing. People love to eat eggs, and you can raise the chickens and get your own eggs. So, I want to thank Kit and Karen for joining us. Glad to enjoying your lunchtime, spending your lunch with me here on this chicken chat. So, you've got your eggs from your chickens. Those are really the basic things. That's what you're going to get started with. That's what you realize that those chickens are going to provide you. But I think as you spend more time with your chickens, you're going to realize that they each have personalities, and you're going to get to know those birds. Some of you are going to name them. I'm going to label you people as the chicken parents, and we may have a little discussion with the chicken parents as we progress through this presentation, talking about some of the things that maybe you guys are doing that may not be the best for your birds, and things that you can do to maybe help your birds get by a little better while still enjoying, the relationship you have with those birds. Now, the chicken parents, those are the ones that are going to name your birds. Certainly, those birds are part of your family, so you definitely have a different relationship with those birds than, say, maybe a chicken owner, who's really just the point is to get the chickens and to get the eggs from the birds. I'm not trying to say that one is better than the other. Certainly whatever is comfortable for you, that's the perfect way to be. So, but I just know that you chicken parents tend to spoil your birds a little more. You coddle them a little more. And so we need to have a little discussion about some of those things that you may be doing. And we'll get to that later. So like all chickens, or like all animals, when you get started, you need to have the basics. You got to have feed, food, water, shelter. We got to protect them from predators, from the environment. And then another big one is finding a veterinarian. Now, fortunately, chickens are pretty hardy, and you shouldn't need to see a veterinarian very often, if ever, assuming that everything goes okay. But mishaps do happen. Sometimes accidents happen. Maybe a predator comes in and wreaks some havoc in your flock. So you may need to get a veterinarian there to help with some of those more extreme health issues. So I always recommend, of all the things that you need for raising chickens and maintaining your flock, a veterinarian is usually the hardest one to find, because there aren't a lot of veterinarians out there who are willing to work with chickens. Now, that is growing. There are more veterinarians get involved because there are more people like you guys out there that are raising chickens and calling veterinarians and say, I've got a chicken, I've got a problem, can I bring it in? So I always recommend trying to find a veterinarian that you can take your chickens to beforehand. It's always best to kind of have that in mind, as if you need it, it's there, instead of when you have the problem and now you're running around, you're frantically trying to figure out, where can I take my chicken to get some answers? So that's the hardest one. I know somebody asked a question about, when your birds needs to go to the vet, and really they don't need to go to the vet unless there's a health issue. There's no shots. There's nothing like a dog or a cat where you're supposed to have annual vaccinations or anything of that nature. It's really, the chickens are actually quite hardy and pretty resistant to a lot of things. There are a few things that they can get, but for the most part, you shouldn't have to need a veterinarian to do anything for your birds. All right, so that's a little bit about getting started. The other thing I'm going to say, if you haven't had any chickens before, or if you're brand new to it, always check with your local government. If you're in an HOA or some sort of property owners association, make sure that you're following the rules in your area for chickens, because not every area can have chickens. For example, I can't have chickens where I live. My HOA doesn't allow me to have chickens. So I do have a lot of chickens at our research farm in Gray Summit, Missouri. We have 12 coops there with birds in them that we do a lot of our research in. It's one of the more unique things about Purina Animal Nutrition, where we have a flock of chickens that we're raising in a backyard setting, and we can do research with. We can test things out when we want to make changes to our feed or make management suggestions. We're doing those with birds that would be similar to what you would have in your backyard, and raised in a way that it's also similar to what you would do it. We're not doing research with commercial chickens and trying to translate that to your backyard setting, because I think we all know it's pretty different. So, you go to the store, you're going to get your chickens, you're going to bring them home. What do you need to do? So the first thing, you're going to need to think about, where am I going to keep those birds? And oftentimes for about the first 6 weeks, we keep them in a brooder. So that's usually somebody, you're going to raise that like indoors, maybe in a garage. And somewhere where you can control the environment a little more, because those young birds need a little more care to get started. We'd like to keep the temperature at 90 to 95 degrees, a little bit of air circulation. We need to protect them against predators, which does include small children and your pets, your dogs and cats that may be in the area. So we need to put them somewhere where they are safe. We can put them in there. We put them in this brooder. Now think of something, we want something that's round in shape. Think like a kiddie pool or a cardboard box, or a bunch of cardboard that you've got set up in kind of a ring shape. We don't like to use boxes or things with corners in them, just because chickens get scared. They tend to run and they get in the corner, and all the chickens will run into that corner. And if you have enough chickens, you end up with a pile of chickens, and the one on the bottom of that pile tends to overheat and suffocate pretty fast. So that's why we like to think of rounds. And if they get kind of spooked, they just kind of keep running in a circle. Now, if you do have a box, you can always put stuff in the corners to help round off those corners. But we want to make it kind of big, because we're going to have a lot of things in there. You're going to have your birds in there. You're going to have your shavings in there. So you have pine shavings 2 to 3 inches deep in there to separate the birds from the floor, so that they, that'll soak up any of the moisture and the dirt that they make. And if there are any water spills, that'll help to separate, soak that up, and then it also separates them from the floor, because oftentimes we're raising them on concrete, and that concrete's going to draw the heat out of those birds. And birds, when they're very young, need to be kept warm. We like to keep them 90 to 95 degrees Fahrenheit during that first week, and then you're going to drop that temperature 5 degrees each week after that. So typically you're going to keep your birds warm. Traditionally, it's been with a heat lamp. That's the big silver lamp shade with a 250 watt bulb screwed into it, and then you hang that above the chickens, and then that just projects the heat down into the birds. So we keep a thermometer underneath there so we can monitor the temperature. Now, I will say there is risk with fire from that, because you do have a 250 watt light bulb hanging over pine shavings, and if for some reason that light bulb, that fixture, falls down into the pine shavings, there's a good chance that you're going to start a fire. So if you're concerned about a fire, there are other options. There are radiant style heaters that you can get. They plug in. They're a platform. The birds can go underneath that platform, and then they raise up against it, and that keeps them warm in there. So that's more like the mother hen effect. So it plugs in. It doesn't get overly hot, so your risk of a fire is certainly less with that. I will warn you, a heat lamp is nice because it's inexpensive. You're looking $20 to $30 depending on the prices of all the various things that you need. However, you've got fire risk there. Your other option, the electric heaters, run anywhere from probably $60 to $100, and maybe even up. You may find deals here and there, but you're certainly looking at a much higher investment cost for getting started with that. But if you are concerned about fires, that is definitely the safer way to go. So you put that, your heat source is typically going to be in the center of the brooder area. And then outside of the brooder area, you're going to put your feeders and your waterers there. So plenty of food, plenty of water for those birds to get to. You're going to raise those up so they're about chest height for the birds. And then as they grow, you just keep raising those up higher and higher. So it's a comfortable height for them. Usually it's around chest height for the birds. All right. Now, keep them in there for 6 weeks. Remember, keep dropping that temperature 5 degrees each week until you hit about 6 weeks. At 6 weeks of age, the birds are feathered enough where they can tolerate cold temperatures. That's down into the 30 and 40 degree range. So at that point, you can start thinking about moving them outside to your coop. The one question that always comes up, when do you move them out there? And I always say it's somewhere between 6 and 16 weeks of age. That's when you're going to want to make that transition. Now, if there are no birds in your coop that's outside, go ahead and, at 6 weeks, you can start thinking about moving them out into that coop and move them out there. However, if you have an older flock already out there, I'm going to ask that you wait until your birds are closer to 16 weeks of age before you make that transition from kind of the brooder area out to the other flock. So I've got 3 reasons for you. One, large chickens typically don't like smaller chickens. So your older hens are going to kind of beat up on the little chickens, your younger birds, until they no longer bother them. And usually that means that the older hens kill the smaller chickens. So not necessarily the most pleasant thing, but it does happen. Secondly, you've got 2 different feeds. Your older birds should be on a layer feed, and your young birds should be on a starter feed. So we've got 2 different diets, 2 different birds in there. They both have different needs. How do we feed birds separately if they're in the same thing? And that's a very challenging thing. So keeping them separate makes it simple. Make sure that everybody's getting the right nutrition so that your older hens are laying eggs and getting the nutrition that they need, and your younger hens are getting the nutrition that they need so that they can grow up and be ready to lay eggs. And then finally, we have disease transmission. That's always a challenge for your birds. The older hens can have diseases that maybe they've been exposed to and they're not susceptible to or show any signs of symptoms. But then your younger birds, you start mixing them together. The young birds, their immune systems aren't quite ready yet. They haven't been exposed to a lot of things, so you can introduce a lot of illness to those younger birds. So, those are 3 good reasons why you don't want to integrate your birds, an old flock and a young flock, until they're roughly the same size. So at 16 weeks of age, the birds are about the same size. Your young birds are certainly closer in size to the larger birds. They can deal with some of that aggression that might come out. You can start to make that transition from a starter feed to a layer feed at 16 weeks of age. And finally, their immune systems are a little more developed and their body isn't growing nearly as fast, so they can deal with some of those challenges that may come up as they get exposed to some new things. All right. Let's see. So we've made the transition. We've got them in the brooder. We've made that transition out to the coop area. I want to talk a little bit about what you want to feed those birds. When you start your birds, you want to start them off on some sort of starter feed. We have a couple of options. We actually have 3 options. That's 3. 1, 2, 3. 3 options for your starter birds. We have two traditional feed options. One is medicated and one is non-medicated. So, if that's an option for you, if you want to feed your birds medicated feed, the medication is not an antibiotic. So if you're concerned about antibiotics in your feed, you don't have to worry about that. We don't put antibiotics in any of our poultry feeds. The medication that is in the feed is amprolium, which helps protect the birds against a common parasite that they get called coccidiosis. Those coccidia is a parasite that affects the intestine of the birds, and it's a pretty common parasite that birds can get. So it's certainly one that we want to protect them. So sometimes you can get birds that have been vaccinated for coccidiosis. If you do have birds that have been vaccinated for coccidiosis, you can feed them the non-medicated feed. That vaccine is going to help them build up immunity to any of the coccidia that they might encounter on their own. So that's going to protect them. However, if they haven't been vaccinated for coccidiosis, then I would recommend that you feed them the medicated feed if you're going to go a traditional feed route. That medication is going to protect those feeds. You're going to start them on the medicated feed at day 0 or when they show up at your house. And then you're going to keep them on that medicated feed until you make the transition to a layer feed. at around 18 weeks of age. So there's no need to bounce back and forth between medicated and non-medicated. The medicated feed doesn't allow the birds to develop any immunity. So if you feed it to them for 2 or 3 weeks and then you switch them to a non-medicated feed, those birds are going to be susceptible to coccidiosis if it's in your area. So once you feed the medicated feed, keep feeding it. If your bird's ward vaccinated for coccidiosis and you start feeding the medicated feed, you're actually going to kill the vaccine, and then those birds are going to be susceptible to coccidiosis. So we want to keep feeding the birds medicated feed until we make that transition. No bouncing back and forth. Once you make a decision, stick with it. Now, if traditional isn't your thing, say you want to go with an organic route, we do have a line of organic feed. Same rules apply. We're going to feed the organic starter grower feed to those birds from hatch up until around 18 weeks of age, when you're going to transition them to their layer feed. All right, so that we've got them started. And then we want to make sure that we're, of all the feeds, Purina, we've designed those feeds to meet all of the nutrient requirements of those birds. Chickens need 38 different nutrients on a daily basis. We've designed the feeds to meet all of those nutrient requirements on a daily basis, whether it's in the start and grow, the medicated, non-medicated, or in the organic line of feed. And we've designed that feed so that it's providing the right nutrition for those birds so that they can grow and develop at the right pace, so that when it comes time to switch them to laying feed, they're ready to go and they will start producing eggs for you. Now, when you get to 18 weeks, that's when we're going to start making that transition from the starter feed to a layer feed. And we have some more options for you here. Again, all of the layer feeds are designed with the same basic principles. They're all 16% protein. They all have around 3.5% calcium. The vitamins and minerals, all the nutrients that those birds need on a daily basis are being met by all of our diets, whether they're the conventional feed or the organic feed, or there's some of the couple of other ones I'm going to talk about in just a second. So we have our tried and true Lena, which is our basic feed, has prebiotics, probiotics, all the good things to keep the gut healthy. We've got an oyster strong system where we incorporate oyster shell right into the pellets, so you don't need to supplement any oyster shell on your own. All the calcium, all the vitamins, all the minerals, all the protein, everything your birds need right there in that feed. So this is, again, where I'm going to talk to the chicken parents a little bit. I know we like to spoil our hens and provide them with other things, but I just want you to realize that we designed the feed to meet all of the nutrient requirements that those birds need on a daily basis. So if your birds never saw anything else, never got to eat anything else but the feed in the bag that comes from Purina, they would be healthy, they would be happy, they would be producing eggs for their entire lives without any issues. So don't feel like you need to give them a variety in their diet. All that feed is there. It provides them all the nutrition that they need. Now, I'm going to talk to you a little bit again when we come to the treats and scratch and some of those things, but we'll get to that again in a second. So we got Lena. If you want maybe a little more nutrition for yourself, we have a product called Lena Plus Omega-3, where we've incorporated flaxseed into that diet. And then the chickens will actually take the omega-3 fatty acids that are in flax and incorporate them into the eggs, so that the eggs that you eat have more omega-3 fatty acids in them. So you're getting a much better diet for yourself. An egg, after you feed the omega-3 product to your chickens for 3 weeks, those eggs are going to have around 250 milligrams of omega-3 fatty acids in each egg. Now, a typical egg, or even a Lena-fed egg, is only going to have about 50 milligrams. So if you're into improving your omega-3 fatty acid intake, that's a great product for you to get it. You can get that without having to take the fish oil tablets or getting some of those fish flavored eggs. So it's a much better way to get better nutrition for yourself. Now, another option we have that's relatively new is our Lena Plus Free Range, where we've incorporated some insect protein into the feed. For those of you that may not allow your birds to get out a whole lot, or maybe during the winter months when there's a lot of snow on the ground, you feel like your birds need some insect protein, we've got a diet that's got black soldier fly larvae incorporated into the feed as well. So now it does say free range. That doesn't mean you should just feed that if your birds are free ranging. Again, it's a complete feed, provides all 38 different nutrients that those birds need on a daily basis. Feed that to your birds, they'll be nice and healthy. And then obviously we have an organic feed as well. So if you want to get organic eggs from your flock, we have organic feed that you can choose from. So those are your options. All 4 feeds have our Oyster Strong system. We've got oyster shell incorporated right into the pellet so that you don't need to supplement with that. All the calcium that they need is right there. All right, so that brings me to treats and scratch, and this is when I'm going to talk to my chicken parents again. Now, I know a lot of you like to spoil your birds. You like to provide them with lots of scratch grains because, you throw out your handful of scratch grains, the birds come running, they start picking at the ground, they pick all those up. But you got to remember, scratch grains are like a bag of potato chips or M&Ms, whatever candy that, you really like. It's a lot of calories. It's not a lot of nutrition in there. Remember, I said layer feed is 16% calcium or 16% protein and around 3.5% calcium. Typically, scratch grains, our Purina scratch grains, is roughly 8 to 10% protein and almost 0% calcium. It's very low. There's almost no calcium in that feed. So as you start feeding more and more of that, you're going to start to see your egg production drop. You're going to see shell quality drop off. So if you do see that your birds, maybe your egg production is starting to suffer a little bit, eggs aren't quite what they should be or what you feel they should be, and you do feed scratch grains and treats and table scraps and everything else that isn't in that complete feed, cut back. Stop feeding that to your birds for about a week or so and see if egg production doesn't start coming back up. Always a good idea. And then we've also developed a line of treats. Purina has a line of treats that you can feed that we've designed to be maybe a little more nutritious in nature, to more complement their layer feed. So it's a little higher in protein, higher in calories, vitamins, minerals. All of those things are more closely matching what the layer feed is. So if you do happen to spoil your birds, you're not necessarily going to cause some major problems. If you start feeding half of their feed coming from scratch grains, you're really going to impact the amount of calcium that they're getting on the daily basis and the amount of protein that they're getting. So check those out. Get to the store. You'll find out some more information about that. And then let's see what have we got for questions. I've been rattling on for so long here. Let's see what we've got for anything. All right, I don't see anybody. Bish is asking, what is the best bedding cleaning process for coops? For as far as the coops go, think about this. You've got kind of 2 sections to your coop, the coop area, and then you've got a run area. So the coop is going to be the part where the birds go maybe to sleep at night. That's where they're going to lay their eggs. Typically, the coop area is going to be the smallest, smaller area. We say roughly 10 square feet per chicken, and figure about 2 to 3 square feet per chicken inside the coop area. That's where we're going to put bedding material in there. So things like pine shavings, that's always probably the most common things you use. We want to stay away from things like newspaper and cedar shavings and sawdust. Those things all have some negative impacts. So pine shavings are always good. Some people, especially when you get older birds, will start to use some hay and straw. Just make sure you're using good quality so that they aren't full of lice and mites and mold and anything else. So there's always some risk there when you start using straw for some bedding material out there. But the birds will certainly love it. They'll pick through it. Just make sure you're using good quality stuff that doesn't appear to be moldy. We certainly don't want that for the birds. Out in the run area, this is where the birds are going to spend the majority of their time. Here we think about 7 to 8 square feet in your run area per chicken. And really out there, you don't really need to put anything down. Whatever you put down, the birds are just going to dig through. So if you have a nice grassy area that is there, in a week or two, that's not going to be grass anymore, because the birds are going to the bathroom there. That's going to burn the grass away. The birds are scratching through it. They're picking stuff up. They're just going to turn it into kind of a mess. So, whatever you feel like, we actually put gravel down in our run area that helps a little bit with some of the runoff that comes in there, and helps to keep the mud down a little bit when it gets wet. But there's nothing you don't need to put a whole lot down in there. The birds are going to dig through that. Even with our gravel bed, they dig through the gravel and they push it out of the way and they get down into the dirt. All right. I see Heather is asking if our organic feed is soybean. No, Heather, our organic feed does include soybean meal in it. All right. Let's see. What are some other questions? Oh, Heather here sent in a question asking about how high the chicken food should be hung for. And again, even when they're out in the coop in the run area, think about chest height is about where that needs to be. So we don't want it all the way down on the ground, but we don't want it too high, just enough where they can reach their head over there. You're going to find if it's too low, they're going to be pulling more feed out of it than what you want. And too high, they obviously won't be able to reach it. So think about chest height. That's about where it should be. Oh, all right. I see there's Heather. Glad you could join us, Heather. You've sent in a question beforehand and you got one now. Keep them coming. All right, we've got somebody here who has Jenny Kennedy has an issue with her birds that are eating their eggs. And this is a common problem that we see. And she says she's got 12 birds and she sees several of them doing that. And unfortunately, it's a learned behavior. Once you have one bird that starts eating eggs, the other chickens are gonna see her doing it, and it's a learned behavior, and everyone starts picking up on it. So, unfortunately, there's not a great way to break your chickens of doing that. Obviously, getting the eggs out as quickly as possible, so that they don't have the opportunity is helpful. I think you said here that you're using some wooden eggs, ceramic eggs. Some people will put golf balls in there. So the idea is the birds peck at those and they don't break. So then they kind of get bored and they run off. Another one I've heard people have success with is they take an egg, they blow out the contents of it, and then they fill it with mustard. And chickens don't like mustard flavor. So it does two things. One, when they break open the egg and they get the beak full of mustard, they don't enjoy that. So hopefully that stops them of doing that. And then the other thing too is as they break into it, you're going to see birds with mustard stains around their beak and face, so you can identify who the culprits are, and then hopefully go from there. So I don't envy you, Jenny. That's a tough habit to break. You certainly want to get ahead of that one before it gets going too far. Let's see. Kit here. She has 3 one-month-old Orpingtons in her brooder. She's getting 10-day-old Brahmas on the 8th. Then they go into the brooder together. Kit, you can certainly put those birds in together. There's a little bit of a risk as you start mixing birds of different ages and coming from different places. Hopefully the birds haven't been exposed to any diseases, but there's always that risk of transmitting disease from one to another. When you have birds that were maybe, somewhere over here, and then you bring them in from somewhere else, these birds over here may have something completely different, and you start mixing them, there can be disease issues. But as far as size goes and feeding wise, those birds, they're going to be eating the same thing. Your 1-month-old probably aren't going to bother the younger birds too much, but always just keep an eye on them and make sure that those day-old birds, those young birds aren't getting, or your 10-day-old birds aren't getting too bad. And even by 10 days, they should be large enough to help deal with some of those 1-month-old birds. So I think you're okay. Just make sure that you kind of transition them off to your coop appropriately as they reach that 18-week of age. All right. Let's see. What other questions? That one. Maggie Shreve says she has some older hens, and she wants to know if there's anything specific that she should be doing for them to stay healthy. So Maggie, I would say, the best thing you do, and you've said some of them are still laying eggs, so around that age is when really egg production starts to come to a stop. Most chickens, the average lifespan of a chicken is 8 to 10 years, and usually egg production is about at its end by 8 years of age. You might see some birds, say you've still got a few here that are laying eggs. but really it's going to be very sporadic on that. So just provide them with, the care that you always give them. If you see that your egg production has really stopped, you might want to consider moving them to a feed that doesn't have all the extra calcium in it. Move them off to flock raiser and that. So there's really not a whole lot to do. At that point, just keep them comfortable. All right. What else? All right. Patricia, are there antibiotics available not from a vet? No, Patricia, there aren't antibiotics available. You need to, if you need antibiotics for whatever reason, you need to work with a veterinarian to get that so that you can make sure that you're using the appropriate antibiotic and the appropriate concentration for those animals. Just using blind antibiotics has kind of gotten us to where we are today. So that's why there are more restrictions around using antibiotics in animal feed. So we need to make sure that we're using them properly. All right, Kit's got another question. Safe ratio for roosters to hens. I think somebody else had that question on my list. Typically, it's 1 rooster for every 10 hens. As you get more roosters than that, you tend to get overbreeding. And you'll start to see the backs of the females be torn up if you have more than that. You start to get more fighting amongst your roosters as they kind of battle for who gets what hen. So 1 rooster for every 10 hens is really kind of the ratio you want to shoot for. I think I saw another question about pecking order. Lisa is asking about how do you stop the pecking order. And well, Lisa, there's nothing you can do about the pecking order. That's just a natural behavior for the birds. They're always, that's just how they function. They have a pecking order. They have one bird who's at the top and then everyone falls into order below that. So there's nothing we can do about that. So, but the only thing you can do is if you see somebody getting picked on or somebody being too aggressive, you have to start thinking about how do you separate those birds so that the ones that are getting picked on can recover, or the ones that are being too aggressive will stop beating up on the other birds. So nothing we can do about that. That's just a natural behavior of chickens. Let's see, what else have we got here? Michelle is asking, mingle chickens with ducks or turkeys. So it's okay to mingle those birds. Now, I will say it gets a little more complicated because those birds have different nutrient requirements. Chickens and ducks, especially as adults, you can get away with feeding the chickens and the ducks. Turkeys, you probably could get by with feeding them with your chickens and ducks, but they do have a little higher protein requirement. We like to keep our turkeys on game bird feed, which is, that one's a little higher protein, 19 to 20% protein for those birds. And depending on your duck and turkey breeds, they aren't always prolific layers, so they're more seasonal. There are some duck breeds that will lay quite a bit. Those you can certainly keep with your layers and make sure everybody's feeding an appropriate feed. So it gets to be a challenge when you start doing that. I know somebody on here asked about wild turkeys. And certainly when it comes to starting birds, we need to feed those birds separately. So chickens require around 18% protein to start, ducks 20% protein, and turkeys somewhere between 28 and 30% protein. So we need to make sure that we're feeding all of those birds the appropriate diet for the right age. So I know they're all birds, but they don't all have the same requirements. So sometimes that's a hard concept for people to get behind. They want one feed to feed everything. We need to make sure that we're meeting all the nutrient requirements of those birds. Just because they're birds doesn't mean they all have the same requirements. Let's see. What else have I got here? Let's see. Oh, Kit, you sent in a question before that you had some 2-year-old chickens that 5 of them quit laying in December, and you were asking about why that might be. And I would say that's probably just due to the natural behavior of the birds. Typically, when your days get shorter, the egg production will fall off, especially in the winter months. It's going to fall off. And then as right around now, as your days start to get longer, egg production is going to start coming up. So your birds are going to about once a year, at least once a year, they're going to take a little break while they molt. And then that's typically happens during the winter months, and especially in the winter months when the days are shorter. The birds don't really be wanting to lay eggs because they don't want to have to raise young chickens during the winter months when there could be snow on the ground. It's cold. It's going to be difficult to keep those birds alive. So Mother Nature is telling your chickens to stop laying eggs during the winter months. You can combat that by providing light for your birds. So if you put your birds on a timer during the winter months, provide them with 14 to 16 hours of daylight during the winter months, you can keep your birds laying eggs through the summer or through the winter in most occasions. All right. Let's see. What else have we got? Light. Oh, Kristen Hopper was asking about, she had some chicks and she wanted to put those chicks with an older hen so that they could raise those birds. And that's always a challenge. A lot of that's going to depend on whether your older hens, what their personality is towards the young birds. If you've gotten a chicken that's a little broodier or maybe a little more motherly in that fashion, then she might raise those birds. But if they weren't hatched by those chickens, you really got to be cautious that they don't cause problems. And again, it gets back to different feed, different nutrition. There's always an illness there. So if your birds weren't hatched by the birds, if your young birds weren't hatched by your hens, I would certainly raise them separately. That's your best bet, because there's so many different things and you never know what's going to happen. And you may have one hen that is fine with taking care, but you may have a couple other hens in there that really don't care for the young birds. So I think you're best to just raise those young birds separately. The chickens, they're not, there's no nursing involved. They're just, it's not, they're not the best mothers if they didn't raise the chicks. So you're probably better off just raising them separately. Let's see. Oh yeah, Jill Antoine was wondering if she could raise wild turkeys with your domestic laying flock. So I don't know about wild turkeys. When it comes to wild animals and turkeys, you always need to make sure that you're following whatever the game and wildlife rules are in your area. So from your area, I don't know what the rules are. I don't know whether you can raise wild turkeys. You can certainly raise domesticated turkeys with your chickens, but again, you have to make sure that you're feeding them the right feed. The turkeys need a different diet than what your chickens do. Once they get older and into that adult phase, turkeys are actually pretty, for the most part, they're pretty docile, even though they are a large bird. They're pretty easygoing, and you could probably keep your turkeys and your chickens in the same area without having any issues. But again, it's like any set of animals, you're always going to have some that are going to get along with others and some that aren't. So you just kind of have to, every situation, there isn't kind of one rule. You just kind of have to take every situation and kind of see what works for you. Let's see what else. Let's see. We talked about floor covering. Becky Nielsen here's a good question. She's got some older hens, 3 to 4+ years. She wants her chickens to lay eggs more regularly. So that brings us to something about what you should expect from your chickens. Chickens are going to start laying eggs around 18 weeks. They're going to lay really well for probably about the first 2 to 3 years of their life. Once they hit that 18-week mark, about 2 years, you should expect roughly an egg every day from your chickens. There'll be a few breaks in there while they molt and take a little rest, but you're going to get good egg production for those first couple of years. Around years 3 and 4, just the natural biology. So every year the chickens lay eggs, their egg production is going to decrease. That first year that they lay eggs, that's going to be the best egg production you're going to get out of those birds. Regardless of what we do from management or from feeding, they're always going to produce fewer eggs the next year. That's nothing we can do about that. That's just biology of the birds. As they get older, they get less productive. So the first 3 years, expect decent egg production out of those birds. From years 4 to 6, egg production really starts to fall off. It may be every other day, it may be every couple of days that they provide an egg. And right around 8 years of age is really when we start to think about eggs, that the chickens are going to stop laying eggs. So unfortunately here, Becky, you provide them with a light, you provide them with the feed, make sure that we're not overfeeding treats and scratch and everything else that isn't a complete feed. See if that doesn't have an impact. But at 3 and 4 years of age, your egg production is just going to slowly decrease. There's not a whole lot we can do about that. All right, Lisa, we talked about your question with roosters. Brandy Buckner asked about recommended using Corid on any new chicks you purchased to prevent cocci. All right, so I discussed that earlier when it comes to feed. Now, I can't recommend you feeding Corid because I don't think Corid is actually labeled for use in chicken. So you certainly don't want to use that. And you'd be better off if you are concerned about coccidiosis to feed the medicated feed. That's going to prevent most outbreaks or keep your birds safe under most conditions when if coccidiosis is a problem. It's not going to prevent every outbreak. If they get overloaded, they can certainly get enough cocci in the environment that will overload what the medication can protect. And then at that point, that's when you need to start working with the veterinarian to decide what's the best treatment option for it. All right. And then I think that's all the questions I have. That answered everybody's question. I think we got through most of that stuff. Let me scroll back through here. Oh, Karen, that's a good question. So, do you need to take the chicks away from hen after hatching or leave them with the flock? Now, that's a good question. If your hens are hatching the eggs themselves, you can certainly leave them with that, with the hen. So, those birds are going to be, there's going to be a little bit of risk there, but that mother hen is actually going to protect those young birds when she hatches them from any of the other flock mates that may get there. So it's up to you to decide what works best for you. You can certainly take the chicks from her after she's hatched them and move them to your brooder and control that environment. Or if you really want to, you can certainly leave them with the flock. But you do need to make sure that you're providing them with a starter feed, because we don't want those young birds eating the layer feed. Now, for the most part, that layer feed is going to be in a feeder that's up higher off the ground that the chicks aren't going to be able to get to. But we need to make sure that they're getting to it. And then we'd also need to make sure that it's in a place where they can get to it, and that the older hens aren't going to, cause problems, or the older hens aren't going to be just eating that feed. So you're going to have to kind of make a decision on your own what works best for you and your flock. If you do notice that some of the other flock mates are harassing your young birds or even the mother hen too much, you may need to either separate the hen and the chicks, or maybe just pull the chicks out of that flock and raise them separately. So we like to say it's easy, but sometimes you've just kind of got to make what works best for you. All of these things are kind of the perfect world recommendations. Take what I'm saying and then kind of incorporate it, kind of manipulate it so it works best for you. So do what you can to make this as easy as possible for yourself, and so that you get the most enjoyment out of your flock and your chickens for years to come. All right. I think, here we go. Heather is asking, what's the best chicken breed for an 8-year-old to start a flock, and how many chickens to start with? That's a good question. There are actually lots of breeds out there. Most chickens are pretty hardy. Plymouth Rocks are good breeds. Americanas are a good breed. Australorps, Wyandottes. Those are some good ones. Orpingtons are another good breed that's pretty hardy and pretty docile. So there's lots of breeds out there that should do well. Even some of the smaller bantams, Seabrights, Silkies, those are smaller versions. They're fun to raise. They're pretty easy to take care of as well. We just want to make sure that when you are getting your children involved with these chickens, that you remember that chickens are natural carriers of salmonella. So regardless of how clean you keep your coop area, they may have salmonella in there. So there's always a risk of getting salmonella poisoning from your chicken. So we want to make sure that we're washing our hands when we deal with those animals. Remember, they bathe. They walk around in their manure. They bathe in dirt. They bathe in their manure. They fluff that stuff up. So when we're holding the chickens, and we're trying to show our love for our chickens, this is again back to you chicken parents. Don't be kissing your chickens. All right. I know we want to cuddle them, we want to love them, but remember, those are birds, those are animals that bathe in dirt and manure. And so there's lots of bacteria inside those things. So just make sure you're taking the right precautions to protect yourself, washing hands. They're not nearly as clean as dogs and cats, so we can't be kind of showing the same sort of affection that you may show a dog or a cat in that way. So the risk is pretty low, but there is the possibility that it's out there. So make sure you're protecting yourself when it comes to that stuff. All right. I think that is going to be our time for today. If there are questions that we didn't get to, hopefully somebody will get to them and get you an answer in the comments section. And I want to thank you for taking the time out of your day to listen to me talk about chickens, and for sending in your questions. And get out to Grange Co-op, one of the stores that they have out there, one of the many stores they have out there. They'll be able to get you some more guidance in store, get you the products, the equipment, things that you need. And if you have more questions, if you're not already a fan of the Purina Poultry Facebook page, I recommend you go over to that Facebook page, like it. We've got lots of information on there. You can see lots of videos of me doing more Facebook Lives, talking about chickens, raising chickens, answering questions. With that, Dr. Patrick Biggs here in St. Louis, Missouri. I want to thank everyone for joining me, and enjoy your time with chickens, and have a great day.